But you guys can just quickly settle in. Let's get started. Thank you very much for joining us. I know this is the post-lunch carbs kicking in session. So we try to keep this very, very interactive and heavily focused on demos. So we keep you guys engaged and interactive here. So with that, currently Anand. With me, I have Jürgen Willis. And we are group program managers with the AppFabric team. And we're very, very excited to be here today, especially given all the announcements that were made around the various capabilities and services of AppFabric, which will be made available on the Windows Azure platform. And we've had several sessions already. So I just want to have a quick show of hands of how many of you either got a chance to attend Clement's session for AppFabric overview, or Hari's session with the overview of AppFabric middleware strategy. OK, so about half of you have seen the first few slides here. So what we'll do is we'll quickly run through the initial slides just to get everyone on the same level plane. And then from that time onwards, I want to use a lot of demos as opposed to really walking through a bunch of slides. This is not the best slot for doing slide-based sessions. So with that, what I really want to focus in the next 70-odd minutes is just talk about the typical challenges that we see with customers building applications, and more specifically in the Azure world now, and how the problems of what we call the islands of capabilities, the silo problem, impacts most customers that we talk to. With that, we'll transition into just talk about how we think holistically of AppFabric applications, which also called Composite applications. And then we'll do a deep dive, probably level 200 to 50, to get into deep details of how do you build these applications, how do you manage these applications using AppFabric developer tools and AppFabric App Manager. So if you followed us since last year PDC, the first time we announced this service and capability was at PDC October of last year as a future roadmap capability that we'll be offering on the Azure platform. And since then, the last 7-odd months, we've come a long way. And I'm happy to say the future is here with AppFabric Composite App Service. The one big change is the branding or the name for the service is a little modified now to actually call it AppFabric Developer Tools, which is the dev capabilities and AppFabric Application Manager. So henceforth, when I refer to AppFabric Application Manager, it kind of was the same thing that what used to be the AppFabric Composite App Service. So just to bridge the gap of what we talked about and what we're referring to it as going forward from now. So with that, I want to get one more show of hands with how many of you have had a chance to build and deploy at least one application in Azure? Half of you. OK, great. So then in that case, what we'll do is we'll step back and talk about this not only as an Azure-specific challenge, but it's a problem that applies to building any n-tier application. And this problem specifically is how do you build n-tier applications? And if you see the capabilities across a very simple website, and an app in this case is a simple auction website. Think of this as a place where I come and make bids. If my bid wins, I check out, I make the payment, and I get the goods shipped to me. A simple n-tier application. Even building applications like this at scale is pretty hard. And the more you want to think about cloud architectures and scale it out further, the harder it gets. Let's break this down a little further into what this application is. At the heart of it, it's a very simple 3-tier application with the web tier, which hosts all my website, ASP.NET in this case. It has a middle tier and a database tier. Data tier could be SQL, could be storage, doesn't matter, any data tier there. And if you really zoom into what the middle tier looks like, that's where all the business logic runs. That's where all the long-running processes run. And it has a large set of technologies that you would use in your application, varying everything from building web services, which get exposed either to your presentation tier or directly to end users. You need caching for scalability and performance. You need to build workflows to have better orchestration, better flow management. You need, of course, the hard problem of solving identity and access, and so on. I mean, the list of the things that you would need to consider and build in an application is pretty large. So if you were to see the application holistically across the middle tier, and specifically the middle tier, also the web tier and the data tier, the application becomes a pretty complex piece, right from the time when you start architecting it as solution architects, to developing the various pieces, to deploying, configuring, manage. And that's the whole problem that we're trying to solve with the AppFabric platform in general. So, and the reason why this is hard is how the industry has evolved over the years. So what's happened is over the years, different vendors have created different silos of capabilities. Each silo is pretty sophisticated and also pretty complex, where you can definitely get the best of breed caching, that you can get the best of breed workflows from pretty much every industry vendor. However, whenever you get each stack, a stack for your web, a stack for your middle tier, with that you get its own corresponding dev programming model. So as developers, you learn to build towards each stack independently. Similarly, as IT pros, you have to manage, configure, scale all of them independently as well. And I don't even want to get into the conversation of how you actually deploy and manage those machines. That's a full session on its own, and how complex that can be when you have to worry about scale out, clustering, deployment, replication, geo-replication, disaster recovery. The number of concepts to deal with that is so huge, it could pretty much be a session of its own. But what I really want to highlight here is the way the industry has approached the problem of building applications has always been in the silos, because every vendor pretty much gives a capability island of its own. So what we're trying to do at Microsoft as a whole is to solve for this problem of what we like to call the problem of islands of capability by removing the levels of redundancy each silo has to offer. So instead of having multiple programming models, the way to solve that is to have one consistent programming model which works across all the various application tiers, including all the various middle tier capabilities. Not just build them, but also be able to consume these services and these capabilities as pre-built services, so that you're not spending a lot of time in setting up your own cache or building your own cache. The number of customers that we talk to which end up creating their own caching solution is so high, and it kind of baffles me to know that capabilities like these, which have been around for a while, are still not accessible and easy to use because of either the complexity in standing them up or programming against them, that more often than not, customers end up creating their own memory cache, their own in-memory databases, just to go solve a very, very basic infrastructure need, as opposed to focusing on the actual business logic, which is where the real money is. Not just from development perspective, but also from a management perspective, the number of tools people end up dealing with, the number of panes of glasses you're looking at to either configure, to either deploy, look at health, look at monitoring, or try troubleshooting an application which spans, let's say, your ASP.NET talking to a WCF service, talking to a database, figuring out where your bottleneck is, figuring out how an error flowed from your middle tier from web tier to middle tier. It's so hard because you have to coordinate across multiple different tools. And in the new world of with the cloud architectures and the promise of Azure, it gives you the scale, it gives you the capacity on demand. However, how do you build config and scaling of your application in a consistent way, regardless of whichever application capability you're using? That, again, is a pretty hard problem to go solve, especially if you have to solve that independently for each capability island here. And the other part is, and the reason I asked how many of you built application in Azure is, we know that people aren't necessarily always moving entire applications to the cloud. They end up having a part of the application in cloud, part of the application on premises, some hybrid, some span. Some cases you just cannot move to the cloud. So you end up making pretty hard choices on your application architecture depending on the capability available either on premises or on cloud, or a common denominator of capabilities available across the two. Hence, one of the other things that we want to solve is that regardless of whether you build for the cloud or you build for the on-premises or both, you build the applications in a very, very consistent way so that you don't have to make hard application choices, architecture choices, when you're thinking of building the application as opposed to making the choice only at deployment time as a topology option. So this is the promise that we have and the conceptual solution that we have on solving the problem, the different problems of different capability islands that exist today in the industry as a whole. So a lot of this theory aside, let me show you real quick on how we are addressing this problem and making progress on solving this end-to-end app tier problem with AppFabric. So I'll do a quick demo, and then we'll get back to slides talking about more deep dive material here. So one of the first things is we want to start with the tools and frameworks you're familiar with. So what you're looking at here is very, very familiar Visual Studio experience. I'm going to build a quick .NET application, have the application built out, which is the same application that you just saw, which I took an example of an auction website with a web front end, talking to a bunch of middleware technologies like WCF services, workflows, and caching. So from that perspective, all the learnings you've had over the years gets carried forward. So nothing changes in the fact how you use Visual Studio. The only thing I have extra on this is I've installed the AppFabric developer tools, and we'll see what that buys you. But if I really look at the application in the Solution Explorer real quick, the application is still the same, where you built your WCF logic as an iAuction service. You still have the same ASP.NET page as your website. That doesn't change. You have a familiar workflow. For those of you familiar with programming against workflows, if you just look at the workflow definition, that also remains the same. That hasn't changed at all. So nothing in the way you build applications has fundamentally changed from the concepts and the tools that you're used to today. Of course, we'll talk about what is specific to getting the cloud architecture benefits. But the point I want to make is, from a dev tooling and a concept count perspective, what you're looking at is essentially the same. What, on top of it, AppFabric developer tools tries to solve and address is the ability to view the application as a whole. So this is the extra metadata, what we like to call the composition model, which gets captured as you build the application. So when you start building the application and you add the web tier, it understands that there's a ASP.NET web page or a WCF service running here. You add more WCF services. You start consuming pre-built services like caching or pre-built services like access control and identity. The AppFabric developer tools is able to capture that intent and relationships between the various components and provide you with a very, very simple conceptual picture of how your entire application actually looks like. So this is the extra metadata that you get to see. Of course, either as a diagram view, or you can look at it as a table view of different relationships. And we'll definitely spend a lot more time going deeper into this in the next few minutes. But this is the dev side experience where we are able to provide a simple entire view of your application. And similarly, on the management side, so this is for developers, on the IT Pro side, you get to view the whole app and get a pretty sophisticated management tooling with the AppFabric Application Manager. So what you're looking here is at the AppFabric Application Manager. I'm going to navigate to the apps that I just built. And what you see, the first thing is the same knowledge that your developer and your architects had across your entire application is translated directly into the knowledge and the views that you get as an IT Pro in the UI. So you're able to see from one plane an application that spans my web tier, it spans my middle tier, and consumes external services. Let me show you a more detailed view of the same, where you get to see your application as things running on a bunch of containers, running on web or middle tier, a bunch of external services it consumes. This is, let me just zoom in. I'm just in the fonts. Oops. You can actually see the list of services that I'm consuming. So whether you chose to use a pre-built service like databases or caching, or in this case, a storage, you're able to view all these consumed services also right from the same pane of glass. This is in addition to being able to look at all the apps itself that are running and the endpoint it exposes. So if you look at the ASP.NET endpoint, look at the WCF endpoint, the entire view of the application is captured in a single location, and you can play with the app and manage it right from this single application manager view. In addition to providing the view for doing basic control and command, it has pretty rich monitoring capabilities as well. Taking the example that I talked about earlier, if you build an application which spans multiple tiers, how do you find out where your latency issues are? Where is a performance bottleneck? Or how well is my application doing as a whole? With AppFabric Application Manager, we're able to generate a lot of rich monitoring information. So you can start looking at how my latency and performance is for my web application, how it is doing for the WCF service which are running in the middle tier. And not just for the code and business logic that you use gets shown up here, but also the services like caching, which you consume, are available so that you can do a pretty rich correlation between how my execution time of a SQL query corresponds with the amount of time it takes for me to run my WCF request and how long it actually impacts my end users from loading the web page. So this ability to get very rich monitoring is a correlation that you can do here as well. And the last point I want to talk about is the ability to quickly scale up and scale down services. And that's another thing that the application manager offers out of the box. We'll spend a lot more time going deeper into this, but I just wanted to give you a quick flavor of that the problem of these islands is what we're trying to address with AppFabric, and the investments we're making across both the developer experiences as well as the management experience with Application Manager is what tries to address this problem in a very holistic way. So I'll come back to the slides for now and talk to you about the big announcement we made with AppFabric. So in addition to a bunch of services that we released, we also talked about releasing the AppFabric Application Manager and developer tools next month. So the bits that you just saw are bits that are going to be released soon. And we'll use these bits to walk through more detailed experiences soon. So I'm going to quickly step back and summarize a lot of the things that it's just rushed through and talk about how we looking at the problem from an n-tier app perspective. So across both server and cloud, we have the web tier, the middle tier, and the data tier. And your application can have one or more of these. In fact, it can have multiple web front ends, it can have multiple middle tier services. To address that, we look at the application holistically as opposed to making you look at the application as a bunch of people looking at the web tier, a bunch of people looking at the data tier. And we're able to provide that and say, let's look at the application depending on what the app definition is at any given moment, and hence manage it as a whole. To make sure that you're not spending a lot of time building the infrastructure services yourself or building scalable runtimes, we also have the AppFabric container as a big investment which provides the scalable, dynamically elastic scale capability container, which lets you run your code and your services at a pretty high scale, whether it's running on server, on premises, or it's running in Azure using the Azure's infrastructure. Now, for the middle tier itself, to make sure that you're not spending cycles building infrastructure services, we offer a whole bunch of pre-built services like caching or access control or service bus, which is a full-blown messaging service. And we have deep dive sessions on all of these at TechEd, which I would strongly encourage you to go watch to learn how you can use caching in your application quickly and never have to worry about standing up your own in-memory storage or in-memory databases. You can just use cache out of the box. Similarly, if you want to build any asynchronous programming between your web tier, middle tier, or connect to devices, Service Bus now has full capabilities. That was the other announcement we made around AppFabric, was the availability of the CTP of Service Bus, which provides you with not just relay capabilities, but also full-blown queues and pub/sub system, so you can connect to external devices, multiple users rather quickly. Access control, which was released earlier in the year, early in April, offers you a full security and credential management system in the cloud, so you don't even have to stand up your own infrastructure for doing either STS or identity management. The parts we're going to focus on here are how do you run custom code and business logic and build n-tier applications using the AppFabric developer tools, and that helps you build business logic around web services and workflows. And the other element of the developer tools, which is how do you have a composition model which helps you describe your n-tier application and the relationships between those. And this composition model is what captures the richness and that metadata required, not just at the development time, which is inherently what gets generated automatically for you, but also gets used by the AppFabric application manager then to run your application and deploy it and manage it for you. So the developer tools generates the model. The model then uses it to deploy the applications to the web tier, middle tier, and data tier on your behalf using the intents and SLAs that you have. We also end up using the same model and same definitions to not only deploy, but also gather very, very rich eventing and monitoring information that we just saw across the various tiers and provide you, through the AppFabric application manager, a single consistent view of how your application behaves in its entirety. So this is the 10,000-foot view of what the AppFabric platform as a whole intends to do, where it's abstracted from the infrastructure, whether it's server or cloud, provides you a bunch of middle-tier services that you can use to build your applications and quickly consume them from any application. Also, a whole bunch of developer tooling capabilities. Then the last piece is the AppFabric Application Manager, which is the management tooling to manage individual services or your end-to-end application. So with that, what we want to do is I want to get to the next level of detail and talk about what are the capabilities coming in the first CDP that we're announcing to be available next month. So what you saw was a conceptual thing. With that, I want to invite Jürgen Willis to come join me here, and let's get a little deeper into the details of what each of these capabilities with developer tools and management platforms looks like. There's a quick question here. We'll take that while Jürgen sets up.
Does this holistically cover both Windows Server AppFabric and Azure AppFabric, or only Azure AppFabric?
The question is, does this holistically cover both Windows Server AppFabric or Azure AppFabric? The short answer is it actually it intends to cover both server and cloud AppFabric. The goal being there should just be one platform that you program against. Today, the capabilities were different. With caching, the first thing we moved from server to cloud. And access control already has its counterpart with Active Directory for some parts and WIF. So the goal is there's only one AppFabric platform eventually, and you program against one, and it translates to server and cloud implementations as necessary. So with that, I want to hold more questions. We can take it in the end. And also, if you can use a microphone, that'll be very helpful because we can record the questions for later replay. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jürgen, who will take us to the next level of detail on what the two capabilities of developer tools and AppFabric management look like.
Great. Thanks, Karan. OK, so let's step back a little bit. Karan showed a little bit more of a complete build-out application with that auction application. Let's get back to basics and do a little hello world to start off here. So this is running on the CTP version of the June release that we're going to provide. Not quite done with their release. We have a few more things we're kind of wrapping up, but not showing you demo bits here. This is really the bits that we're working on. So file new project. When I do that in Visual Studio, haven't installed the Azure AppFabric SDK, I'm going to see a new category of templates here. I see these AppFabric templates. I'm going to see a few different templates here. I'm going to come back to these, the last three templates here and a set of patterns that we'll provide. We'll see more of that in a moment. Let me do just a new empty AppFabric application. Okay. When I do that, I'm going to get sort of the blank canvas, if you will. That is this design view of the application. At this point, I can go in and say I want to add a new service into my application. I'll get a whole list of different capabilities that are available to me up in Azure and AppFabric. We'll start simple here by adding a WCF service. This is going to add in a WCF service project as you would be familiar with today. So same kind of WCF template that you would get in Visual Studio today. If you've built WCF services before, you'll recognize the familiar sort of get data operations, and we're just going to leverage this in our app here. So I'll go back to my application. Now when I see my app view here, I see that I've added in this WCF service. I can go down and look at the endpoint information on that. I see all the config associated with the service and the individual endpoints that I'm surfacing on that service down here. Quick little edit I'll make here that will go away before we ship CTP. And with that, I have my very first Hello World AppFabric application. What I can do now is I can come back up here to my application project. So we have this separate AppFabric application project that is part of this solution, or a deployment project, if you will, that contains the overall composition model. It is the description of the application in terms of the application components, in terms of the configuration on those components, in terms of the dependencies among those components. And that becomes a richer model as we'll kind of build out more and more of the app. On this project, then, I can say that I want to go ahead and publish this up to Azure AppFabric. So I give my application a name. Putting in here the namespace. So when I go into the CTP, I'm going to go provision a new namespace. Much as you might today go into Service Bus or Cache or ACS and provision a new namespace there. For the CTP, you'll go up and you'll provision a new namespace for AppFabric apps. So I've already provisioned my namespace. I'll plop in my management key for that, and I just hit publish. So if I come down here and I open up my output window, I'm going to see all the magic happening here in terms of packaging up that application, generating a full application manifest out of that composition model that we defined. So it's uploading the package now to Azure AppFabric. Looks like publish has been successful here. So let's go back to our AppFabric console. Now I come back here, I see that it's added a new Hello World 2 application. If I drill into that, I'll go ahead and deploy the application and specify that I want to start this application as soon as the deployment completes. Right? So I see a few things here already. I see the root URI associated with my application. I see the signing key associated with the application. Obviously, the diagram is a very, very simple diagram here because there's only one component that's in my application. Now, what I could go do at this point is go ahead and over to the list view. I could drill down. I'm seeing the container. So this is the AppFabric container that WCF service is being deployed to. I drill down here, next level of detail. I can see the endpoint information. I can see that I'm navigating down through the resources in my application itself. If I come back here, I can go to config information at the container level. Let me drill one level. Sorry, let me drill one level deeper here. If I go config here, I see some of my WCF configuration that I can go ahead and edit within the management console environment. If I come back up to the top level application, I can see that it's still deploying here. Also admin log information. So if I go there, obviously I'm just now in the process of deploying the application. So all of the log information I'm getting is associated with the deployment steps that are required for provisioning the overall application. So now it's flipped out of deployment mode, and it's going ahead and starting up the application itself. Come back to the top level application. I'll see down here that I have all of the endpoints exposed out of the application. As soon as the application finishes starting here, I'll be able to kind of drill down into the endpoint and see the standard sort of WCF page associated with the service. There we go. So now the application is started. So if you've built WCF services before, this page is going to look pretty familiar. It gives me some information in terms of how to go call this service. All I want to do is copy, paste the URL there. I just have a very simple console app now using a channel factory to call that service. I'll paste in the address of that thing. Again, this is just the standard sort of get data service template on the WCF service. Pass in a integer, get back the string echo of that integer, right? So if you built Azure applications before, you'll notice that my sort of process for spinning up the application, deploying that to Azure, having that service available to me, much quicker here. In the deployment process, we're not spinning up new roles or VMs. Basically, all of the role instances are pre-provisioned by the AppFabric environment. The environment is up and running and ready for your application to be deployed into, right? So that'll be true for all of the things running in the mid-tier and deployed to Azure AppFabric. And so I have a little bit sort of faster cycle time, if you will, in terms of my development process, deploying up to Azure, testing out my application within the Azure environment, and so on. You'll also sort of observe in the process of building this app, I wasn't doing anything in terms of adding new roles and so on. I was purely focused on what's the definition of my application, right, and building out the logic of my application, and that's where my focus was in terms of building the app and then deploying the app. So that's the simple hello world of application. Now let's take a look at a little bit sort of more sophisticated capabilities. Sure. We'll take one question and then we'll ask to hold the questions.
So are you suggesting we use this one instead of the worker role for managing
So the question was about using this versus worker role. So all of these capabilities sit on top of the Azure service model capabilities that exist out there today. So basically, we're just providing a mechanism here to up-level the experience for building the applications and managing those applications on top of the Azure infrastructure that you have today. In this scenario, you would not create a worker role. That's right. You would basically define, your services, your workflows, and so on. You would deploy those into the Azure environment as opposed to separately defining a new worker role instance and putting your logic into that. Okay. All right. So let's come back here. A little bit more sort of tour of the environment, if you will. I went through that pretty quickly. In my add new service here, so these are the set of services that we'll provide out of the box with this CTP. I'll be able to add in ASP application, Azure blob storage, table storage, access to the caching, the AppFabric caching service, to service bus queues and topics, SQL, Azure. I'll have access to a couple different types of WCF services. You see here a stateful service. So I'm not going to spend time today talking about the distinction between stateless and stateful services. Bob Schmidt has a talk tomorrow morning, I think it is, that goes into more detail around kind of the stateless, stateful infrastructure of AppFabric. A task scheduler for scheduling callbacks, if you will, or sort of call-outs to URIs that I provision, adding workflows and so on. Right. So these sort of set of out-of-the-box services that we'll provide, and there's extensibility around that mechanism as well. So let's go ahead and build a little bit more sophisticated application. Let me add a new AppFabric application here. And there's a few different ways I can think about getting my projects and my technology implementations into the application. So I showed the first mechanism where I kind of come top down and say I want to add new services. I obviously may have existing project artifacts that are out there that I want to leverage as part of my application and sort of pull into this composition model. And I can do exactly that. So I can come down here and say that I want to add an existing project. And if I navigate down here, I'm going to go ahead and go to an existing ASP project that I've pre-built. And that's going to pull in the ASP project itself. It's going to observe that there's an ASP app that, as part of this project, that's going to be added into the application. Let me add one more project here. And I'm going to add a WCF service project that's going to be leveraged by that ASP app. Right. So now the infrastructure has observed the artifacts associated with the projects I've pulled in. If I had multiple WCF services in that project, it would have observed that there are 1, 2, 3 different WCF services, and it would have reflected that as part of the application definition. Right. So we basically want to provide 3 key mechanisms for how you recognize project artifacts. One is that you add the services from the top level here. 2, that you can add projects, add new project from Solution Explorer as you do all the time today. And 3 is that you can import existing projects. Basically, we want to provide the mechanisms that are most familiar with you, that you're most comfortable with, that provide sort of the right path for you to leverage both existing artifacts as well as more greenfield environments of building brand new Azure applications. Okay, so I've added in my applications here. So now I have my project-based artifacts representing the application, right, by virtue of the ASP project and the WCF service. Now there's a bunch of things that I want to add into my application that are not project-based, but are rather leveraging services up in the Azure environment. More specifically, the AppFabric caching service, the SQL Azure service, as well as a third-party service, right? So the basic scenario here is that I want an application that's going to maintain my stock portfolio, right? Where I can go up and hit a page, I can see my stock portfolio, I can get quotes for all the stocks in my portfolio, I can go and get quotes on new stocks and that sort of thing, right? So I've built kind of the front end for that. I've built a service that's going to have all the business logic associated with the ASP app. If I come in here, I can say that I want to go ahead and reference the WCF service from the Oops, I got to flip this. Cron, I told you had to remind me. So I'll come down here and say that I want to reference that WCF service from the ASP project, right? And what I'm doing here is I'm basically describing the dependencies among the aspects of my application, right? And so what's this doing on my behalf is basically doing some of the wire up that's required. One, it actually expresses the dependencies in the application manifest such that when this application gets installed, the application manager knows where all of these things lives and knows the dependencies among these things and knows how to route requests between the application components throughout the infrastructure. That's the first thing. From a development time aspect, all right. Sorry, one moment. VS is not cooperating. Did I mention that we're wrapping up the release? All right, we're going to give this another shot here. So to refresh your memory, where I was added in the ASP project. We'll do that again quickly. And the WCF service. I'll build a solution here. What's that? Yeah. Oh, did I? Let's go. Okay, we'll improvise here a little bit. So let me just add a new empty WCF service. Okay. So I've added a service into my project here. if I come back here, I can go ahead and add in reference to the AppFabric caching service, right? So if I come in here, I can come down and I can see the config associated with that. If you went to either Hari's talk on middleware strategies or you went to Clement's talk on lap around Azure AppFabric, you would have seen the experience for coding against the caching service. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of what that involves. In short, from a CDP standpoint, I would have a namespace associated with the cache. So here's the management portal. I have a namespace associated with the cache. If I come down here, I can see that I can get my authentication token information that I want to copy into VS and add on to there we go. Add on here. I can add in the host namespace and so on. So just sort of standard stuff in terms of provisioning against the cache. I can add in another service here, which is SQL Azure. SQL Azure, this should look very familiar to you from developing against SQL. I'll need my server connection string for my provisioned SQL Azure database. I have a database name here. I have a couple options. One is that I can basically just represent that I'm calling against the database in my application. I can actually provision into the database as part of the application as well. So if I want to provision the database schema itself as part of deploying the application, I can simply attach a DAC pack into this artifacts collection associated with the SQL Azure component. Quick question, who is using DAC packs today for deployment? Okay, so a small number of folks. So if you wanted to provision via the DAC pack, you go in and add a SQL data tier project. The output of that thing is going to generate a DAC pack, which you could attach here. Again, if you wanted to deploy the scheme as part of the overall application definition, or you can simply point to an existing SQL Azure database instance. Okay. Last service I'm going to add in here is this custom service that I've defined. So we're shipping out of the box a set of services that you can go and build into your Azure application. This is an extensible model. So if I wanted to call a third-party service, this is a Yahoo service that just simply returns stock quotes, I could just do standard, add service reference, get my proxy, code against that to call the service. If, however, I want to do modeling of that service call and of that dependency in my application, I can write a small amount of code that plugs into our system here, which can do a couple of things. One is it can represent that service in the application. Two, if you wanted to do some steps associated with deployment, you could do that as well. If you wanted to get metrics off of these service calls against that third-party service, you could capture that as well and have that surface in the management console. And the last thing is you can actually plug into our synchronization framework. So a lot of things that I'm talking about here in terms of the wire up between components and what happens there is happening by virtue of the plugging in of these services into a synchronization framework such that when I, for example, add a new item, that gets captured in the composition model representation. When I tie together two services, it's doing the wire up between those services. So there's an extensibility model here that can be leveraged. I'll go ahead and add this one in. Now let me come into my service and say that my WCF service is going to call each one of these things, right? And so I can see the services available to me. So it's going to go out to SQL Azure to go and load my portfolio. It's going to go to the data cache for caching stock quote information. It's going to go out to this Yahoo third-party service to get new quotes, right? I can add all of those things into my application. Now, what this gesture has done on my behalf is a few things. One, it's gone ahead and added all of the necessary assembly references into that WCF project, right? So the assembly references I need in terms of like these caching client assemblies, I don't have to go figure out what are the right assemblies and go add reference those and so on. I'm simply seeing the description of the capabilities of my app. I'm wiring those things up, and I'm having sort of all of that done on my behalf. Now let me do one more thing here. Let me try just loading up one of those other projects so I can show you one more thing. Okay. So if I come down here, the last thing in terms of sort of the wire up of the components is the code I want to show you here. So we're also working on making it easier within your code as well to access all of the different components that you've wired up here. So we're still working on kind of simplifying the API representation here, and by the time we ship the CTP, this will become an even more straightforward experience. But we have this API that basically allows you to address the things in your application using a logical naming, right? So I could have a logical name here that might be, something more like, Yahoo service endpoint, right? And I can reference that against my application. I can resolve that. That's going to return me back a client type. So this could be a generated proxy type, or this could be a static client type if I was calling the cache service, for example, or calling against service bus. I get that client back, and then I can just program against that. So I can have a very consistent experience for doing that against all of the services that I've added as part of my application. Okay. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to the pre-deployed version of that application, so we don't spend the time deploying the overall app. If I go into this stock ticker app here, I can see that I have a representation of my application here. Again, I could jump in, I can do config of that application if I wanted to come down here and scale out tiers of that application. So I may be getting heavier hits or more latency on the ASP front end side, and I can scale that out. Excuse me. Or I could actually have more load on sort of the mid tier and want to scale that out. And so I can separately scale out basically the tiers of my application that are under the most load. I can come back here to the monitoring view. You saw Karan show some of this before with the auction app. I can come out here and see different aspects of how my application is performing. The thing I didn't sort of point out there in terms of for example, calling into SQL Azure, calling into cache, is the mechanism that I showed there in terms of resolving the proxy or resolving the client's library type is actually doing the wire up to emit the right monitoring events such that it can be captured in this monitoring view, right? So certainly you could go out and just spin up a new SQL connection and program against SQL Azure that way. Basically, what we're doing on your behalf when you go through our infrastructure to get back that SQL connection instance is we're doing all the wiring such that that SQL connection calls will emit the right events to our infrastructure and pull all of that monitoring information together into this single view for you. Okay? All righty. Okay. All right, so let's come back to Visual Studio. So I promised you that I would come back and explain some of those other project types there. So we've been working with this empty AppFabric application, which gives you this template environment. We also have this notion of shipping patterns, right? Think about this as sort of ways to kind of bootstrap you for certain kinds of applications. In CTP, we're shipping 3 different pattern examples. These are sort of merely starting points, if you will. We'll want to get feedback from you in terms of what are the most useful sets of patterns that you'd like to see in the box. Some of these we can ship in the SDK. Some of these we could just make separately downloadable. And in fact, this pattern infrastructure is an extensible infrastructure so that you'll be able to build out your own custom patterns as well. So let's look through a few examples. We have a Silverlight business application. So if you're using Silverlight RIA applications today, this is going to look very, very similar to RIA applications, but brought into this AppFabric Azure environment. And there's actually a RIA session later today, I think it is, that's going to go a little bit more detail here. Business application, that's a front-end ASP app, calls workflow that orchestrates across services, integrates with SQL Azure as well. And I want to go into this third example, which is a pattern for ASP.NET with cache. So when I select this pattern, it's basically going to add in all of the associated project artifacts for this pattern. It's also going to add in the references to the AppFabric services that get used in this pattern. So the simplest way for me to describe this is to actually go to the app definition itself. Let me open up the diagram there. So this is simply an MVC app that is pre-wired to call into the cache service, also calls into SQL Azure. You can obviously add your own projects. You can customize this pattern. You can go and implement the logic associated with the MAC web app itself. But this is basically a way to kind of get you bootstrapped for certain kinds of experiences. If I come into the web config for the MVC app, I'm going to see that it's done a little bit more on my behalf as well. Not only just the application description, but actually if I look at the web config for the MVC project, I'm going to see that the config wire-up has been done for my cache client. I'll scroll down here a little bit. I'll see that my session state is wired up against cache here as well. So again, I could do all of this by hand. Some of this will be done on your behalf when you go manually, if you will, build out an AppFabric service and connect up services. Just a way to get you started in the environment. Okay. All right, and I want to show you one more thing, and then we'll flip back to some slides. So we've showed, some kind of medium complexity applications, if you will. I want to give you a view of just a slightly larger application and show you some of the diagramming richness that will come with this. So the diagramming itself, we're building on top of some of the core sort of UI infrastructure that comes with Architecture Explorers and Architecture Explorer and that set of tools. Who is using Architecture Explorer or some of those ultimate tools? A handful of folks, maybe 5, 6 folks, something like that. So some of this is probably going to look familiar to you, at least in terms of kind of look and feel. So it's what's actually doing here is it's loading in the application. Recognizing all of the references, building out the diagram representation, and so on. So we'll give this a moment. And so here I see the app definition. If I come in here and load up those tools, say I want to create that directed graph representation, I can see some of the different visualizations that I can see. I can orient the diagram in different ways. What I find to be one of the interesting sort of views here is to select one of the components, get the butterfly view. I can orient things, basically say, hey, I'm particularly interested in a service implementation or a workflow or the ASP front end. I want to see the dependencies among those things. I can choose to come in here and say, well, I really want to kind of drill into what are just the dependencies associated with the one thing. I'm just worried about this service implementation. I want to know who might be impacted if I change the contract, for example. I want to know who it calls. And so on, right? So, again, just a little bit of sort of visualization goodness that might make it a little bit easier as you think about continuing to build out and maintain your application. Okay. All right. Okay. So with that, let me wrap up the developer tools section with a couple of slides. Here. So here we see the default set of CTP capabilities that we'll provide with this first June CTP. In terms of the developer tools itself, these are some of the core sort of principles that we had in mind when we were delivering these developer tools. First is we want to provide some new capabilities to you. We want to provide this abstraction on top of the Azure app authoring experience that you have today. We want to make it easier to build these integrated distributed applications both for Azure and for premise. But we want to do that in a way that will feel very consistent with what you do today in terms of working with project artifacts and item artifacts and that sort of thing. So really kind of bridging that in terms of continuity with what you know today while adding some new capabilities that should provide sort of the right ROI to you, if you will, in terms of experience. In terms of the experience itself that we're adding in, we want to make it super easy for you to discover, hey, what can I go do in this environment, right? So rather than kind of going to MSDN and finding the right article and what's the right SDK download and what's the assembly reference to go add and so on, make it very super discoverable. Like, here's my UI, here's what I can add in my application. I do that, and I'm getting a lot of those capabilities sort of directly added into my application. We want to provide a consistent experience, so whether I'm composing workflows, services, database, cache, service bus, and so on, I feel a consistent experience in terms of how I go build those applications. And then I also want to provide more visualization of the dependencies. These are kind of step one of experience associated with the visualization, where I just sort of see the dependencies. Over time, you can certainly imagine those becoming much richer and helping you actually manage the dependencies among these components, right? Extensible model in terms of what you can plug into the composition model. I showed the Yahoo service as one example. Extensible model in terms of the patterns that you can very easily go add in. It's just a physics project to go in and add in new custom patterns into your environment. A local simulation environment. So we do have a local simulation environment for debugging your application. Basically, think about that in terms of additional simulation capabilities we have on top of the Azure AppFabric for those of you building Azure applications today. And re-emphasize the point here that we're building this model and these set of capabilities for both cloud and premise, initially delivered in CTP in the cloud, provides us a very sort of good mechanism for rapid incubation and innovation on these capabilities, but we will deliver these things down into AppFabric server environment as well. Okay. With that, let me turn it back over to Karan.
Thank you, Jürgen. So stepping back, a quick recap of what you just saw was nowhere during the development experience did we have to talk about what roles, what VMs, what instances do I need to deal with. You didn't have to worry about how do I wire up my web to talk to an IP address or to an endpoint. Those are concepts that you have to deal with today because that's where the state of the union is. And that's the reason why there's a tight handshake between the developer tooling and the management subsystem and the management runtime that we've built so that your logical artifacts, your logical applications can get translated into a clear set of instructions for the management runtime to deal with. Specifically, what the AppFabric application manager does is it not only takes your application and the artifacts, so it has all the DLLs and files that it needs to run the app, it also is able to take the same manifest to deploy and manage the end-to-end application, as opposed to you having to deal with individual app artifacts and manage them and wiring them up together. A classic example would be, let's assume you want to have 10 web frontends talking to 5 middle-tier services or 5 up-tier services. Today, it's a pretty complex piece where, as and when you add more services, you need to go wire them up to the right backend services. So either you do address virtualization, or you do logical name mapping, or you manage a whole bunch of list of DNS host namespaces. Those are all concepts you have to deal with. And as you transition to a cloud architecture, those become even harder because your application and actual machines just move around. The whole promise of cloud is it's dynamically elastic, it's scalable, things move around. In that world, how do you still keep your application intact and not have to worry about how the pieces move together? That's where the application manager comes in. It's able to translate the work you did at dev tooling time, which Jürgen mentioned, to define the application constructs, gets used to deploy and manage the relationships between various pieces so that you don't have to worry about where your application really runs in terms of physical infrastructure itself. The other big thing, and it goes back to the question I was asked earlier, this is completely layered on top of the Windows Azure infrastructure itself. So internally, yes, we do use the web roles, we use the worker roles. That's what the container is built on top of. And Azure provides a first-class on-demand capacity and elastic infrastructure for us to build on. And AppFabric abstracts the notion of those machines and roles and instances from you so that you, as app developers, focus more cycles on writing business logic than worrying about how to do the mappings and leverage the on-demand capacity and scale capabilities of the Azure platform. So it's a clear tearing between what the infrastructure offers from Windows Azure and what AppFabric provides in terms of a higher-level abstraction to deal with there. And the last thing is the whole SLAs. We touched upon it in multiple different points during the demo. The whole concept of dealing with the application is at an SLA level. So you're dealing with concepts like, I need to be able to scale out my mid-tier. You don't have to worry about that I'm buying more roles, provisioning more instances, winding those things up. It's number of instances, and in future, we expect this to be even more SLA-driven, where today, cache you buy saying, I want to get 1 gig of cache. Regardless of number of machines, the cache needs to be distributed on how HA gets set up. That's not a concept you deal with. Same concept is what we're trying to apply across the AppFabric stack, where based on your SLAs, the number of instances, number of infrastructure, machines required, just get provisioned for you without you ever having to think about it. So you deal with, I need a 10 gig database, I need 1 gig cache, I need to have 3 instances or instances serving hundreds of users. That's the language you talk to the system, and system is able to translate those intents, and of course, to billing eventually as well, on how to run that run the application on your behalf. The most critical thing is the system is inherently wired to be secure. So Jürgen briefly mentioned about the access control tokens that you get. The entire application, regardless of whether running in a single tenant or multi-tenant infrastructure, provides the right isolation and security, both from a provides isolation both from a security perspective as well as from a performance SLA, so that we guarantee that another person or another user's application does not impact the performance of your application, or another application cannot read or interact with any data of your application. So it's inherently secure multi-tenant environment. That's the real value of the AppFabric container. It provides a runtime, so you don't have to worry about those concepts regardless of where the application runs itself. So as we're doing a little good on time, I'm going to spend 2 minutes on this slide. This is a little bit deep dive into what the management infrastructure really looks like and what it does. And we can come back and take questions on this later if we need to. But essentially, it's what you saw was the application manager is a Silverlight portal. You can access the entire set of capabilities, what's available in portal, also via a REST endpoint. So if you're an ISV in the audience, or if you want to build your own customized solution, you can actually build pretty much the entire app manager portal yourself, or embed it in your tooling, because it's completely accessible via a REST endpoint. We'll also eventually ship PowerShell. We'll probably have samples of PowerShell when you ship CDP, so you can interact with the system with PowerShell for automation as well. What the endpoint does is it takes the application package, which is the app package that got generated using Visual Studio, and uploads the app into the AppFabric config store. This is the other big problem that we keep hearing from customers, that I don't have one place to go look at my entire app's configuration of various artifacts. My configuration is usually spread across multiple different machines, nodes, systems, that for me to have one view that my database password's changing and how it's going to impact all my applications, it's hard to do that. Or I want to switch to a different certificate across my application, I have to go touch certificate. So what the config store does is it's a centralized store to manage your entire app's config from a single point to deal with. Then as next thing, you can update those config settings even after you build the application. That is the state separation that we have between what settings the developer needs to worry about and the settings that your IT pro or your app admin needs to worry about. Because things like which connection string to use, which password to use, those are things that can keep changing. You don't want to regenerate your application packages every time you do that. So all the config is split out and kept where you can keep editing depending on whether you're putting in staging environments or production environments. You're able to separate the config that's required for an app from the actual config required for the store itself or the app itself. Then the app manager is able to take that into an app and do the heavy lifting for you to spread the app across the web tier, the web containers, in this case ASP.NET or web roles, spread it across the AppFabric container to run your middle tier logic, talk to a database, orchestrate the deployment of your database. If the database pre-provision, you can only do the schema updates, or if you don't even want to do that, you can just reference the database, and that's a control that you have. Similarly, go provision or just use a cache, use a storage. And this model is extensible, that you want to plug in your own custom LOB endpoint, and you want your net new applications to be configured in a certain way, you can plug in your own pre-provisioning step or pre-configuration step that gets automatically run when the application is getting deployed. So you have full control over end tiers and end services, whether it's internal, third party, doesn't matter, to be able to spread your app logically across all of those. At runtime, of course, you have full support of being able to stop the entire application, so you don't have to worry about stopping your web tier, making sure your database is stopped. You can just start and stop the whole app in one click. And that's a part of being able to view the app as a whole, as opposed to looking at individual pieces, that you have to get full control and command at the app level. And also being able to configure the whole app post-deployment as well, including things like scale. You can do it after the fact and dynamically, so you don't even have to bring down the app to be able to dynamically scale it up. Last but not least, we've made a significant set of investments in building the monitoring and troubleshooting infrastructure so that you don't have to worry about doing a remote desktop into 8 machines, groveling through logs, merging the log files. We generate a whole bunch of meters and metrics for you by default. So you get all the basic meters without even writing a single line of code. The fact that you use one of the existing services that Jürgen talked about, you get all the ASP.NET latencies, database latencies, calls, gets, puts, pretty fancy instrumentation out of the box. And if you are an ISV and you're extending using the same infrastructure, you can plug in your custom meters. A classic example would be, we talked about the Yahoo Finance service. If you're Yahoo and you're shipping that capability, you can also meter things like a number of times stock quote 1 got caught. So you have a pretty sophisticated way to plug into the metering subsystem that we have and the metric system we have to provide very rich custom metrics in addition to the metrics we offer out of the box. That's on the monitoring side. On the troubleshooting side, you can dynamically turn up and turn down the fact that I need to be able to troubleshoot on an app that's running in production or in staging. So and more importantly, and very important in the context of a cloud architecture and cloud environment, is you have no idea at any given time which machines and which infrastructure your app is running on. Hence, App Manager does the heavy lifting of talking to all the spread out pieces of your app, collate the relevant logs, relevant ETLs, and relevant files for you to be able to consume them centrally and store them into the troubleshooting and monitoring store at a single location to go troubleshoot from. So those are the big pieces you can use. And if you, in post CDP, you can look at the monitoring logs to also fine-tune and update your configuration depending on how your system is behaving at any given time. So it's a pretty rich app lifecycle experience and a bunch of tooling to enable you to do that so that you are not spending cycles in worrying about things that the infrastructure or the platform should be doing for you. And you worry about how your application and your end users are dealing with the app capabilities itself. So with that, I want to step back and just quickly summarize what you saw here were not just the pre-built services, but the availability of the actual container to run custom code and dev tools and App Manager. The obvious question is, when is this all going to be available? So we've shipped the pre-built services like caching and access control. These two were available as production services back in April. Then yesterday, or actually the day before now, we announced the CTP availability of the service bus enhancements, which include a full queue. So you can have a persistent queue, durable queue. And in addition to that, you have a full PubSub and topic-like capability. So you can, one person publishes, hundreds of people get notified, hundreds of devices get notified, all those capabilities. Clemens covered that in detail in his session yesterday. That was Service Bus that got announced. And in June, next is where all the capabilities we just talked about across the developer tooling and the application manager will be available for you to use in CDP. So a few more weeks, and hence we'll iron out the issues we run into right now. But stay tuned for the June CDP release with the AppFabric June SDK. And going forward, by second half of this year, we'll do another refresh of the same CDP with more capabilities that we talked about from an SLA-based management, richer tooling, and also release the first CDP of the integration capabilities. So if you're doing, you want to do any more fancy rules, transformations, you can actually use the integration capabilities as well, which are on the roadmap for second half of this year. So what you're looking at is a pretty compelling roadmap of where things were last year when we talked at PDC. We pretty much had coming soon, coming soon, coming soon, coming in future. And in 7 to 8 months that we've coming back and talking to you, most of them have either hit CDP or are already production as well. So the point being, we are on a very, very rapid cadence of delivering 2 to 3 releases per year in Azure. And that's the whole benefit of being able to quickly iterate in the cloud and then offer, to your question earlier, offer these capabilities also on server. Some of these capabilities already, like caching, is already available on server anyway. But all the other capabilities that we keep talking about, built on the new cloud architecture, will be available in the regular server ship cadence of 2 to 3 year release cycles. So quick and frequent iterations in the cloud. We bake the service, get your feedback, get you to play with it, and we're able to bake it and then ship it on server. So in a nutshell, what you just saw was we want to make sure that experience of building end-to-end application, not just middle tier, because a lot of people do associate AppFabric with middle tier, but AppFabric is middle tier services and the app platform. We want to make sure that your end-to-end experience of building the app and taking it through the entire life cycle of build, config, manage, deploy, and run, monitor and troubleshoot, it's very, very easy and more SLA and concept. Man, I need to get some water. Sorry about that. A lot easier with the help of AppFabric developer tools. Make a lot of investments to allow you to have effortless scale, which is through a single set of clicks and one-click button click, you can able to scale out your entire application or its parts. And most importantly, the reason we're making a lot of these investments in App Manager is that the amount of time you spend in managing the infrastructure becomes a lot lower. So your total cost of ownership of running an app, whether it be in Azure or eventually in server, becomes a lot lower because you're not worried about building the plumbing or spending time in operations or spending time in monitoring and management. So with that, I want to open the floor up for questions, invite Jürgen as well. I know we have about 5 minutes left. So before we take questions, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate that. And we're very excited about this service. So stay tuned for the release next month. And we'd love to hear your feedback once it's out as well. Thank you.
So question here, did I understand correctly that when you deploy with the application manager, the instances have already been provisioned for you? How's that to do, what's that got to do with cost? Because currently you have to pay for deployments on Azure even if they're not running. How is that from this perspective?
Right. So two-part answer to that. First part is a general caveat because I have some folks from marketing staring right at me, don't answer questions on billing. So I'm not going to answer questions on specific billing. But the point about pre-provisioned is today it takes a lot of time for you to deploy the application, wait for it to start. So we want to solve that problem with AppFabric Container for middle tier services that the infrastructure is pre-provisioned, and we are paying the cost for the infrastructure running. And only when you deploy your application and starts using it is when you get paid, charged for it.
That's great.
So you don't have to worry about idle time or when you haven't deployed the application.
And the other question, a follow-up question, actually, how do you do that? How do you pre-provision the instances without us telling you how many we need? Or
Excellent. So that's a whole concept of the pre-built services that we offer is we create a large farm of machines where the services get deployed. This holds true for caching, for service bus, for access control, where we provision a certain set of capacity initially, assuming a certain set of load. And the promise of cloud is that we understand a lot of people will be using it, that we're able to provision a certain amount of capacity. Second, the infrastructure is dynamic and is elastic so that if more people start coming in, we can very quickly scale that up and scale that down depending on load. So you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact that it's multi-tenant and secure, we're able to manage the ups and downs of different customers to give you the lowest cost available at any given time for you to go use that service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is also regarding the whole licensing scheme. Yeah, that's a big deal. Right now we pay for every virtual machine that's deployed that. So still not clear on how would that affect. So if I have an app, composite app with a web and then a couple of services, right now we would need 3 virtual machines at the very minimum because each one stays in every virtual machine. How would that be here? Would we be charged on a? How are we going to get charged?
Right.
I guess.
So as my previous caveat, even though we're not discussing licensing, I think the conceptual answer to think about is if you're using a full VM, and that's the amount of compute resources, in one way or the other, yes, you will pay for it. How much is a different question. That depends on pricing.
Sure.
But the fact that for AppFabric Container, because it's a multi-tenant service, you're not paying for the full VM unless you really request that I want to run in a dedicated environment, as an example.
Okay.
But you pay for a part of a VM, if you will.
Yeah, we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about kind of the AppFabric container infrastructure level. But for example, you'll be able to specify what is sort of the isolation level that you want to provide. Do you want your app running sort of entirely in your own VM, or is process level isolation sufficient for your application, such that you can have many, many processes running on an existing VM instance, right?
Okay.
And obviously,
So
the amount of resources you're using are going to impact
So
costs.
we can pick and choose between
Yes.
those models. Okay.
You can.
Is that built in right now? Into that management?
Actually, the CDP is going to be a free service for you to try out, so you don't have to worry about paying anything. It's completely free service, including the compute resources. We
Okay.
just want feedback at this stage. And the only other parallel I would look at is the way cache, and cache is a publicly available production service. The way you ask for cache is I want 1 gig of cache. How many physical machines it maps to set up the HA failover does not matter. We don't. That's a cost that we absorb. You don't have to worry about.
Okay.
You pay for 1 gig of usable cache. Similarly, we'll give you certain compute capabilities. How it maps to infrastructure is a detail that you shouldn't have to worry about. That's a whole PaaS promise.
Okay.
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 So with that, I'll offload all other licensing questions to these gentlemen sitting in the middle. Pricing? Sure. Actually, we have about 40 seconds out. I want to take a few more questions, but we'll be here so we can clear up the room for the next speaker.